I'd like to introduce my colleague, Steve Lieberman, who is president of Lieberman Consulting, and he is also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Health Policy at the Brookings Institution. Steve discloses that he is a consultant to pharma on issues that are not related to the paper he's going to be presenting on generic drugs. So, Steve?
Thank you, Paul, and it is a pleasure to be here, and I want to acknowledge that this project, while it was more involved than I had originally thought, it was a terrific partnership working with Paul. This morning, let me see, that's what I'm looking for. This morning I'm going to go over 9 slides, and those slides present the work that we have done in more detail in the paper that's available. I will try not to repeat what was said at this morning's excellent discussion, but just to underscore a couple of points to help frame the discussion. There are annually 4 billion generic prescriptions dispensed at retail at a cost of slightly over $100 billion. That's 27% of overall retail spending on prescription drugs. And as was noted in this morning's discussion, rebates play an extremely important role, but an extremely dissimilar role between generic and brand drugs. With respect to brand drugs, rebates flow from brand manufacturers through PBMs to plans, and they lower plan costs. In contrast, generic manufacturers send their rebates, typically through wholesalers now, to pharmacies. As a result, the pharmacy costs of acquiring drugs are dramatically different than the listed or wholesale or published price. The PBMs, as we heard this morning, play a central role in the drug distribution system. And just to highlight 2 of their roles, one is, as we heard this morning, they negotiate on behalf of plans the terms that plans pay to pharmacies when they dispense drugs. In their other roles, PBMs run very large mail-order pharmacy operations. What we're proposing is to address the fact that different parties have very different information about the actual cost of generic drugs that when pharmacies buy them. And we believe that selectively disclosing those prices to plans would have the effect of empowering plans to negotiate lower rates. To the extent that that is true, that could produce significant savings. Just as a sizing exercise, if the average prescription drug, generic drug, which costs $26, had its price reduced by $1, which is less than 4%, that would result in $4 billion in lower spending by the health system. We've already heard that generic drugs now dominate the market. They're 89% of the scripts. The pharmacy market has changed very significantly in a number of ways. More recently, driven by a trend in Medicare Part D prescription drug plans, narrow networks of preferred pharmacies have become common. About a decade ago, there was a disruptive innovation when Walmart pioneered the notion of what are now called $4 generics, a program that's become widely adopted by many other mass retailers such as pharmacy chains and big box stores. Part of the reason that that was so disruptive is that 10 years ago, the estimated cost of dispensing a drug, which has remained pretty much the same today, is estimated at $11 without regard to having to pay for the ingredients. Another change that's occurred quite dramatically over the last 10 to 20 years is that 20 years ago, Most pharmacies contracted directly with generic manufacturers. Now most of them contract with wholesalers or other similar organizations. Those organizations not only distribute the drugs, but also arrange the rebates. As we've heard, the business-to-business relationships in the drug distribution chain are extremely complicated, and they involve manufacturers, wholesalers, plans, PBMs, and pharmacies. And again, just to underscore an important point, the actual net price that a pharmacy pays for when acquiring generic drugs and the actual price that a health plan pays for brand drugs are not at all, are neither public nor do they approximate the published prices. There's a slide that I've attached, which I'm not going to spend any time on, but if you look at the paper on page 12, it has the similar information that summarizes the 5 major price indices that are currently in wide use, although AMP is an important measure, but it is not at all public. The most common prices that are available are so-called AWP and WAC, and those are list prices, and because they exclude discounts and rebates, they markedly overstate actual prices paid by end users. I want to quickly highlight 2 others. NADAC, which was created in 2013, is a new measure. It purports to represent the national average drug acquisition cost, and it unfortunately has serious, if not fatal, flaws. Just to highlight one of the serious deficiencies, and there are others, NADAC only includes on-invoice discounts, and it ignores off-invoice rebates. Just a quick word about Medicare's ASP, or average sales price, which was created in 2003. That is a list price, but it's reported at a very aggregated level for a limited number of drugs, those that are covered under Part B of Medicare. To put the drug distribution system in context, it's very important, I think, to try to identify how this market for consumers differs from more conventional consumer purchases. The first and perhaps most obvious thing is before a consumer, otherwise known as a patient, can acquire a prescription drug, they need to have a physician or other licensed clinician write that prescription. Second, health plans have become extremely sophisticated in using formularies and cost sharing to steer or influence consumer choice. And third, and perhaps most importantly, the actual cost of a drug, as we heard this morning, is masked from a consumer, in large part because third-party payers are paying the bulk of the cost. Again, I don't want to repeat what we've already heard this morning, but precisely because the manufactured rebates bypass pharmacies for brand drugs, pharmacies typically acquire brand ingredients at very close to the published price, what's called wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC. In fact, the best estimate we've seen is that on average it's 96% of WAC. However, because generic rebates flow directly to, or indirectly, to pharmacies, that lowers their net price well below the published price. In fact, our estimate is that on average, and there's obviously a wide distribution of costs depending upon the individual drug, the time period, the characteristics of the purchaser, but on average, pharmacies pay WAC minus 70%. Now, let me state that slightly differently. On average, when a pharmacy acquires a generic drug, it pays 30% of the published list price. The interesting point, if you look at the top of this slide, the average brand drug costs $308. The average generic script was approximately 1/12 of that. In spite of that, a 2016 report by the Department of Insurance in the state of Washington confirmed what CBO had already previously reported, which is that pharmacy profits are greater on generic drugs than on brand drugs, which is consistent with what NIR had reported this morning. Our proposal is to make information about average generic drug acquisition costs available to health plans in a restricted, selective way. The way we propose to do this is to require all wholesalers to report what their actual net prices are when they sell drugs to retail pharmacies. We would make this a condition of licensure, and all wholesalers since 2013 have been required to be licensed. And we would take advantage of the fact that the wholesalers have extremely sophisticated, highly capable information systems. We'd have CMS collect, aggregate, and de-identify the information. We'd have the averages reported and there would be exceptions to this, but our suggested starting position would be to have the averages reported at the ingredient, dosage, strength, and route of administration level. The HHS Secretary would issue regulations, much as is done currently with Medicare ASP and Medicaid's AMP program, and would have plans paid for this through user fees. Importantly, the information that would be reported would be both confidential and treated as a trade secret, and it would not be capable of being reverse engineered to identify the prices that either individual manufacturers or individual customers were incurring. As I'll describe in a couple minutes, we also think there are significant ways to either increase or decrease the level of granularity and the degree of price transparency that could be reported. We're sensitive to this because the antitrust experts in the Federal Trade Commission in particular has longstanding concerns that increasing price transparency, as we heard briefly in the previous panel, can have the effect of undermining competition and leading to price collusion. Before getting to an analysis of what we think the plans, our proposal will actually do, I just want to underscore that, and maybe the simplest way to say this is to update Polonius's advice to his son, which was neither a lender nor borrower be. For a PBM, it might be, don't be both a price setter and a price taker. And the question is, to the extent that PBMs have very detailed information about what actual ingredient costs are, because they run mail order pharmacies, and health plans typically do not have comparable access, would that redress the current level of reimbursement that plans are incurring? Clearly, to the extent that the prices that PBMs negotiate as reimbursement at the retail level are linked to reimbursement at the mail order level, they directly benefit from keeping prices high. Unfortunately, the economics literature has relatively little research to inform the question of whether in a concentrated market or consolidated market, whether knowing the seller's cost structure would assist the buyer. In our paper, we cite 3 examples. The most relevant one to healthcare is a relatively recent study which suggests that when hospitals share information about the costs of purchasing stents, they've been able to have their prices go down without it having adverse effects. Again, we're proposing to have our price information report information to plans that would be kept confidential. And we believe that there are ways to reduce the risks of having that pricing information being disclosed and as a result, allowing manufacturers to engage in inclusive pricing because of the increased transparency, which is the traditional FTC concern. First, we would suggest disclosure only of national averages and as I've mentioned before, only on a de-identified basis that could not be re-identified. Second, given the very sophisticated IT systems and capability, it is quite possible to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach and to tailor the level of disclosure to the characteristics of individual products. So consider two examples. If we have something like amoxicillin, and let's say there are 10 or more manufacturers and no single dominant customer, then one could have potentially much more granular disclosure of information. In contrast, if you have a product where there are only 2 manufacturers or there's a dominant customer, one would want to report information in a much more aggregated way. In our paper, we identify a whole series of dimensions which essentially are policy levers that could be adjusted to change the level of granularity of reporting. We also suggest that it would be prudent to start at the level of relatively aggregated reporting with limited disclosure only to plans, but that on a selective basis, one could use demonstration authority to experiment and to try, in the appropriate setting, to increase levels of granularity. So let me conclude, and I look forward to our discussion, by re-emphasizing 4 points. The retail market for generic prescription drugs is enormous. It's extraordinarily complicated, and there's significant information asymmetry among key players. Given the role of PBMs, the question becomes, would providing health plans with more information enable those health plans to negotiate lower rates? And just to give, again, to re-emphasize the sizing exercise, a less than 4% reduction, $1, in the cost of a generic script would lower costs or spending by $4 billion. We believe that reporting actual average prices to plans would have the beneficial effect of putting them in a more informed place. The question is, if the plans have the information, does that enable them to get lower prices? To be sure, to the extent that lower prices are achieved, which means that payers and consumers, patients, are paying less, that money would pretty directly come out of the profits and retention of pharmacies and PBMs. We have in the paper, we outline a very specific proposal about how to do this, and our analysis suggests that selectively reporting averages to plans would not impair manufacturer competition, nor would it facilitate price collusion on the part of manufacturers. With that, thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.